Hi, I'm Christy Obachowski, a managing director in Baird's Technology and Services Group, where I'm responsible for coverage of governance, risk, and compliance. I'd like to welcome you to Baird's 2023 GRC Showcase, and it's a pleasure to have with us today John Arendes, the CEO of Traliant. John, thanks for being with us today. Appreciate the time. Before we get into questions, can you please give us just a brief introduction to Traliant?
Sure. Thanks, Christy, for having me. I really appreciate it. Excuse me. So Traliant is really an organization that focuses on creating what we like to say is effective compliance training courses, which runs the gamut in ethics and compliance. So everything from anti-harassment training to anti-money laundering training, and then everything in between. And in fact, we're expanding our breadth of content moving here into May, where we're going to be creating and supporting environmental health and safety content, which we think is going to be an important aspect of what we deliver to our customers as we think about moving forward into the ESG type of world, as we all hear about every day today. Excellent.
Appreciate that introduction. So we're certainly living in a very complex world from a business perspective, from a macroeconomic or macro environment perspective. You know, as you think about kind of predictive or proactive versus reactive compliance, are you seeing a demand shift from what may have been reactive before to preemption?
Absolutely. You know, we've as an organization, myself independently, has had a number of conversations with chief compliance officers, and really what has been interesting to hear them talk about is how do we get out in front of the issues before they happen. And we are starting to look at things like, how do you use question level analysis from courses to help with understanding what potential risk areas you have as an organization. Not only that, but then how do you use other data like case management data, email correspondence, bringing that all together, and then using it. As we all know, AI has really come out in the forefront, taking that data and using AI possibly to help us look at the predictive out in front risk areas that we have as organizations. And we're hearing a lot about that, and we're getting customers who are asking about that continuously.
Yeah, and so for a client that has been reactive in the past, what's prompting the shift on their end, and how can you, and I think you touched on this a little bit, how can you effectively help companies make this shift?
So what's prompting them really is we think about some areas, and I think a great example, I was talking to one CCO, was talking about Silicon Valley Bank, right? And how do you get out in front of those risk areas proactively by accumulating data out there? And so these are things like that are happening in real time in in the banking industry that is causing people to say, okay, as a board member, how do I see that? How do I get reports that are helping us guide that before it happens, independent, let's say, of our management team, right? So I want to have a report that lets me show that. So, and chief compliance officers are feeling the risk in the sense of the DOJ is starting to look at guidelines that are saying you're going to be held personally responsible for a lot of these interactions. And so they want to say, okay, help me protect my organization and myself. From our perspective, we're trying to, I think, get to the point of at least one aspect of this many-pronged problem is, how do we measure effectiveness of training? And so when we're looking at that, we want to build out the ability, and we're working on this, to predict, you rolled out 1,000 anti-harassment, you rolled out to 1,000 employees anti-harassment training. We've identified, in these departments, somewhat of a higher risk level based on the questions that are being asked or answered and how they were answered. And so we're looking at how do we work with industrial psychologists to actually form these questions, and then on the back end, how do we analyze that data?
Excellent. Want to shift a little bit and talk a bit about ESG. There's a lot in the press in and around ESG. I think companies certainly want to do good by being good. But what role does ESG really play in preserving a company's culture and integrity?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, when you look at so many facets of ESG today and you see in the press, so many different positives and negatives and what have you. But really, I think when you look at what ESG brings to the table for an organization, it shows that an organization is focused on its culture by thinking about social issues, by thinking about safety issues. How do I make my employees feel safe at work? How do I make my employees understand what it is we're doing as an organization to do right by our people as employees, our customers, and our globe? And I think that's really what organizations are thinking about with ESG as we move forward. And I think, depending, and one of the things I look at this and I've had discussions on is somewhat ESG is becoming generationally important. So my generation may not have thought about ESG as critical as, let's say, my daughter does, who's 23 now, has a broader view of it and a view of importance. And so I think we have to think about that as we roll out training programs and think about this more broadly is who is our future constituents and what's important to them, whether I'm a consumer of a product or I'm an employee of that company who thinks about ESG.
Excellent. As you think about just GRC solutions broadly, what are you seeing in the way that you deliver your solutions or the way that broad GRC vendors can deliver solutions to deliver meaningful impact in the ESG arena?
Yeah, so it's so funny. We talk ESG, GRC, they're starting to blend. There really is a significant crossover between the two. I think about delivery. If I put it into our world in particular as it relates to training, the challenge is people want more training that is much shorter. And there's always a challenge with that because there's a lot of data there. So as we think about the delivery and what's important, at least for customers, we're hearing a lot, well, how can I deliver so much content, but I only want it in 10 minutes. And I think one of the things that we need to think about as organizations and as vendors is how can we help with that, whether that's short bites, but over time. I think that's really critical. And I think whether or not it's GRC, ESG, all of which we have to get it to the point that the users want to engage with the technology or the platform, such as training, for example. And I think that's really important. And then just taking it one step further, one of the reasons why we developed the EH&S content that we're doing is because health and safety is such a big parameter of both GRC and ESG, because if you think about it, we now work in a world where it's just not an office, but as an employer and as a CEO, I think about all the time, well, is my employees' office safe? Do we need to give them ergonomics? Do we need to give them slip, trips, and fall? Because what is my responsibility? And not only that, what we have found when we're doing this internally, offering these type of courses for our employees to look at before we released it, they really found value in it. And they appreciated fire extinguisher safety, which is kind of interesting because they didn't know how to use a fire extinguisher. Well, these are all things that have a social impact, they have an environmental impact, and they have an impact to our employees' well-being. And then you take the regulatory spot, right? If you have an issue, let's say with an employee who had a slip, trip, or fall at home, and you're an employer that had rolled this out as part of the help, who knows where you go with this, but at least we've done something. So I think this is all evolving. Hopefully that helps, Christy.
Yeah, no, it certainly does. And everyone throws around GRC, ESG, as you think about ESG, right? There's kind of three specific components to that: environmental, social, and governance. And you talked a little bit on it. Are you seeing a focus on any particular area? Because, I think if you look across, vendors in the ESG landscape, there's vendors that specialize in specific elements, right? You don't see a lot kind of across the board focusing on all of E, S, and G. What's your perspective on, where you focus, what clients are looking for, and, where do you see kind of the areas that are going to drive kind of the need for more kind of vendor support in each of those categories?
Yeah, for us, what we're seeing a lot when we think about the S part, it's a combination of, we have a number of mental wellness courses. That's a big course for us, and it's actually a number of courses that we see employees wanting to deliver to their employee base. That's really important. We're also seeing, obviously, DEI is still an important, not a regulatory issue like preventing discrimination and harassment, but DEI is an important aspect of that social component. So we see that quite a bit. And then, the mental wellness, the safety, that is another component that people all want to see. So to your point, right, there's a whole issue or vendors like for environmental that you could really go down a path. But we're seeing customers asking us for give us the high level top 10 things that ESG has for us, and many of them will say, well, governance. If I think about governance, I'm already doing it with some of my regulatory training, like preventing discrimination and harassment, anti-money laundering, those type of things. But give me those things that help me sort of think about ESG, and also let my employees know that we're thinking about it. Because I think, Christy, you and I as practitioners and others here know GRC quite well, but it's not as advertised as much as ESG. It's not in the news. And then so for employees, it's like, well, what are we doing for ESG? Tell me about that. And so we're hearing a lot of those areas.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I think companies, do want to have ESG initiatives, but most of them don't know where to start, because a lot of it, is not necessarily governed by regulations. It's just starting to, I think it may be more prevalent in Europe than here in the US. As you think about kind of your client base, is there kind of an education component to your clients in helping them understand, what they need from an ESG perspective?
Thank you. Yes. Great segue. So we actually developed a whole ESG suite, and it's for the customers, like you said, the mid-market. We know that the big companies all they can fund those, bring in those people. But to your point, we have many customers, and I say mid-market, but these are 2,000 person companies, 500, who are saying, hey, I don't really know about this. I don't have the money to bring in a specific ESG person, but I need to educate either a group of my staff, and also I want to educate my employees. Like, what does it mean? Because unfortunately, someone reads an article and they think, oh, we're not doing this. And so we've created this suite that's actually being used quite a bit for people to roll it out to educate their employees, but also their staff, to say, oh, these are the things I need to be thinking about as an ESG program. These are the things we're going to be doing. Oh, and how do I build out my overall program with ESG? So we've actually put a whole suite of ESG courses, or courses that make up a nice ESG program that customers can roll out.
Perfect. Certainly sounds like you're ahead of the curve, and certainly a good partner to your clients as they think about, what they might need from an ESG perspective. You had touched a little bit on this, EHS training and the impact on ESG. Can you talk a little bit more about that intersection between ESG and EHS, and maybe what, opportunities or perhaps challenges does EHS as a whole create for GRC vendors?
Well, great question. So I think at the end of the day, as we know, GRC, there's a number of vendors that will not do much with the training aspect, right? but we know that for us, where it can be a component of it. So I think really what GRC vendors and all of us need to be thinking about with EHS is that, I'm going to say this because it's become to the forefront post-COVID. I will say most of the time when we were doing EH&S, it was really only thought about in the manufacturing, maybe retail space. Now, I will say that it really came out to everybody because people had to think about PPE. And if I was going back to the office, did I have to wear a mask? And oh, I want to know more about the biohazard or bloodborne pathogens and all of that. Suddenly, that became to the forefront of just, business services organizations. And so I think what GRC vendors need to think about is how do I make sure that taking any data in, for example, it's not just about incident reporting any longer on a harassment issue, but it could be an incident report based on a safety hazard. Or I've heard of others that are in the business of incident management where someone has called to say that John is coughing in the office and I'm not comfortable. And so we have to think about that. Those are new things that are coming out there with environmental health and safety. It's at the forefront of everybody's mind now, I think, and employees.
Yeah, I think that's right. As you think about, other trends that you see on the horizon, anything that we've not talked about today, or maybe even something that we touched on that you think are going to be big drivers of both GRC vendors, GRC, EHS, ESG kind of training providers. What are you seeing kind of from the front lines?
I think you're going to see AI play a huge shift in how we're going to go to market. And what I mean by that, I think you're going to see a whole shift into, for example, email. How do I collect data? And I've seen this going, I've read some articles, and I really believe this is the next phase of sort of risk mitigation is I want to take large amounts of communication data that goes through my organization, and I want to be able to identify risk areas. And so I'm hearing a lot of that, talking with various, now this is mostly big companies, but how do I take all this information that I have going through my servers without trying to be too big brotherish, but at the same time using technology that helps me identify risks? And some of this comes from, and some of the folks I've been talking to, when you see some of these unfortunate incidents in the workplace with active shooter and other harassment issues, how can I prevent that at the forefront? It goes back to the predictability. So I think you're going to start to see AI get more and more embedded in compliance solutions. I think also the other forefront of this, and we talk about training, is the ethical use of AI. And how do we use it? And how are we going to train people on the ethical use of it? ChatGPT is very interesting. I love playing with it. It's amazing how it could write a whole course for you. It could write a speech for you. Is that ethically if we're going out and doing that, or write work paper for me? I think we're going to have to start thinking about the ethical use in the workplace. Is it productivity, or is it plagiarism? Which one is it?
Very, very good point. I know AI and Chat GBT has been all over the news. I think it's going to, impact all of us sooner than I think we thought, right? I think we all thought, AI was further into the future, but it's here, right? And so I think we need to figure out kind of how we use this kind of effectively and efficiently, and certainly will certainly be a big part of the overall risk management ecosystem.
And I think I just saw an article that Samsung banned the use of it in their corporation. One of the reasons being that someone actually put proprietary code in there that they wanted to debug, and now that went into the system, right? So I think from an ethics and a GRC point of view, I think that's going to be the next thing we all have to be thinking about it. What are the risk area that we expose our business? I was thinking about it the other day. I go to create a product. I use ChatGPT. Is it theirs? Is it ours? Is it all of that? Who owns that now?
Yep. No, totally agreed. Well, I think we're going to see a lot more to come on this front over the next year. But I think it's certainly been great chatting with you today, John, and always appreciate your insights in the sector and space, and look forward to speaking with you soon.
Yes, thank you, Christy. I always appreciate the time.